Watchman Nee carried a deep conviction that true spiritual authority is not something a man claims for himself. It is something heaven imparts through the crucible of surrender. He understood that authority in the kingdom of God cannot be taken, earned, or performed. It must be birthed in brokenness, humility, and obedience. To him, authority was not about position, but about possession, being so fully possessed by Christ that one's words, actions, and very presence carry the fragrance of divine reality. This authority cannot be imitated because it flows from a life completely yielded to God's will. He often taught that spiritual authority is measured not by how many people obey you, but by how completely you obey God. Watchman Nee never sought power or influence. He sought to disappear so that only Christ could be seen. The more he emptied himself, the more heaven filled him, and because he lived a crucified life, his words carried an invisible power that pierced hearts. When he spoke, it was not mere teaching. It was the release of a spiritual reality that had been formed in the furnace of suffering. People who heard him could sense something greater than intellect or eloquence. They felt the authority of one who had been with God. This authority came at a great price. Watchman Nee's journey was marked by losses that stripped him of all human strength. He lost freedom, recognition, and even fellowship. Yet in losing everything, he gained something eternal. His authority was born in weakness, for he had learned that when the self is silenced, Christ speaks. When the flesh is broken, the Spirit reigns. His power did not come from bold speech, but from quiet surrender. In this way, his life reflected the pattern of Jesus, the one who had all authority yet humbled himself to the point of the cross. In his hidden seasons, Watchman Nee learned to recognize the subtle difference between human influence and divine authority. Influence can be gained by charisma or intellect, but authority comes only through death to self. It cannot be faked, and it cannot be transferred. It is the invisible mark God places on those who have been proven faithful in the secret place. Nee was not interested in being followed. He was interested in being faithful. And because of that, people followed not the man, but the Spirit that flowed through him. Even in prison, when his body was confined, his authority grew stronger. Letters and teachings that came from those dark years carried the fragrance of eternity because they were written by a man who had died completely to his own will. The guards could silence his mouth, but not his spirit. His words continued to travel far beyond the prison walls, transforming lives across generations. Watchman Nee showed the world that true authority is not loud. It is holy. It is the quiet weight that comes from intimacy with God. He never demanded respect, yet the heavens bore witness to his life. His authority was not in what he commanded others to do, but in the power of what he himself had become, a man under the full lordship of Christ. And that invisible mantle of authority remains the most enduring mark of his legacy, proving that those who kneel lowest before God stand tallest in his kingdom. Watchman Nee lived by a principle that few understood and even fewer practiced: the power of hidden sacrifice. To him, the greatest offerings to God were not the ones made in public view, but the ones quietly laid upon the unseen altar of the heart. He believed that true devotion is measured not by what we give when others are watching, but by what we surrender when no one will ever know. His life was filled with such silent sacrifices, moments of letting go, of yielding his desires, his comfort, and his future entirely to the will of God. Each hidden sacrifice became a step deeper into the mystery of divine fellowship. Watchman Nee's ministry demanded many visible sacrifices, but the ones that shaped his spirit most were invisible. There were countless times he gave up opportunities to grow his influence or secure his comfort, simply because he sensed God's quiet no. These decisions were not easy. They cost him dearly in worldly terms, but he understood that the value of a sacrifice is determined by its secrecy. If man sees it and praises it, it loses its fragrance before heaven. The sweetest sacrifices, he taught, are the ones known only to God. They rise like incense, unseen but unforgettable. One of the greatest examples of his hidden sacrifice was his acceptance of imprisonment. He could have sought escape, compromise, or recognition, but instead he chose silence and surrender. The world saw him as a prisoner, but in truth he was offering his life on the altar of obedience. Behind those bars, every day became an act of worship. Every moment of suffering, every deprivation, and every loss became another secret gift to his Lord. It was not the pain that glorified God. It was the surrender within the pain. Hidden sacrifice also meant relinquishing his need to be understood. Many misjudged him, misquoted him, or dismissed his teachings, yet he never defended himself. He let God be his vindication. That silence was not weakness, it was worship. By refusing to fight for his own reputation, he placed his trust entirely in the justice and timing of heaven. This discipline of silent surrender gave his life a rare purity. He lived for an audience of one. Watchman Nee often wrote that when God wants to use a person greatly, he must first lead them through a series of hidden losses. These losses are not punishments, but purifications. They strip away the unnecessary, so that only what is eternal remains. Nee's sacrifices were not dramatic acts of martyrdom, but quiet choices of love, giving up the right to be seen, the right to be heard, the right to be honored. Through those hidden sacrifices, his soul was freed from self and filled with the fragrance of Christ. By the end of his life, everything he owned, everything he had built, and everything he could claim had been laid down. Yet he died rich in the only currency that matters in eternity: faith, obedience, and love. His hidden sacrifices became his testimony. They taught the world that what is unseen is often the most sacred, and that true greatness is born not from what we achieve, but from what we quietly surrender to God. Watchman Nee believed deeply in what he called the ministry of the inner man, the quiet transformation that takes place within before any outward work can truly bear fruit. He understood that God is not impressed by activity, but by authenticity. To him, the secret life of the heart mattered far more than public ministry or recognition. He often taught that what happens in the hidden chambers of a believer's soul determines the power, purity, and authority of everything that happens outwardly. If the inner man is weak, the outer ministry will eventually collapse. Therefore, he made the cultivation of the inner life his lifelong pursuit, a silent, sacred discipline between his spirit and God. Watchman Nee's writings reveal a man who knew that transformation begins not with effort, but with surrender. The inner man is not strengthened by striving, but by dying. He believed that every believer must experience an inward breaking, a separation between the soul and the spirit, so that the life of Christ can flow unhindered through them. He saw that many serve God outwardly while their hearts remain unyielded. They may preach, teach, or lead, but without the cross working within, their service lacks spiritual weight. For Nee, the true measure of ministry was not what a person did, but who they had become through communion with Christ. He lived this truth. His public ministry was simply an overflow of his private fellowship. When people heard him speak, they were not just hearing ideas. They were encountering a man who had been deeply transformed. His words carried a spiritual fragrance because they were birthed in the secret dealings of the Spirit. Every message came from personal experience. Pain turned into revelation, trials turned into testimony. He never spoke from theory. He spoke from transformation. This inner work required constant cooperation with the Holy Spirit. Watchman Nee allowed God to expose his motives, strip away pride, and reveal hidden layers of self that hindered the flow of grace. He once wrote that the Spirit's primary task is not to make us powerful, but to make us pure. Power without purity, he warned, is dangerous. And so, he submitted daily to the refining fire of God, letting him cleanse every corner of his heart. His imprisonment became the ultimate stage for this inner ministry. Deprived of outward service, he was forced inward, deeper into fellowship with Christ. What others saw as loss, he saw as divine invitation. In the silence of his cell, God continued to shape him, polishing his spirit until it reflected the image of Christ. By the time his earthly journey ended, Watchman Nee had become what he preached, a man whose outer life was merely the echo of an inner reality. For him, the ministry of the inner man was not optional, it was essential. Without it, outward service becomes hollow. With it, even silence becomes powerful. Watchman Nee's life stands as a living reminder that God works from the inside out. True spiritual authority, lasting fruit, and heavenly wisdom are all born in that invisible sanctuary within, where the soul surrenders, the Spirit listens, and Christ reigns supreme. Watchman Nee often spoke of a hidden exchange that takes place in the life of a true disciple, the surrender of human strength for divine power. He called it the exchanged life, a mystery of the Christian walk in which a person ceases to rely on their own wisdom, energy, or will, and allows Christ to live and act through them. This truth became one of the deepest revelations of his ministry, yet it was something he lived long before he ever taught it. Through countless trials, he learned that God never blesses human strength, he replaces it. Every time Nee came to the end of himself, he found that grace began where his effort ended. For Watchman Nee, surrender was not an emotional moment but a daily discipline. He realized that the most subtle enemy of spiritual life is self-reliance, the belief that one can serve God through natural ability or determination. True transformation, he said, comes only when a person recognizes their utter inability apart from Christ. The flesh must fail before the Spirit can reign. In his early ministry, he was gifted, intelligent, and passionate, but over time, God led him into circumstances where all those strengths proved insufficient. Through illness, loss, misunderstanding, and imprisonment, he discovered the deeper truth: it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. This inner exchange changed everything about how he lived and served. He stopped striving to produce spiritual results and began resting in the power of Christ within. His prayers became less about asking for help and more about yielding to divine strength. He came to see that God does not need strong men, he needs surrendered ones. The moment a believer gives up the need to control outcomes and admits their weakness, the life of Christ begins to flow unhindered. That life brings peace instead of pressure, clarity instead of confusion, and fruitfulness instead of fatigue. In the darkness of his prison cell, this truth became his lifeline. Cut off from ministry, books, and fellowship, Watchman Nee learned to lean entirely on the indwelling Christ. His physical strength faded, but his spiritual vitality grew brighter. He wrote that when a man has no strength left, but continues to trust, that is when God's power is revealed in its fullness. What seemed like defeat to the world was, in reality, victory in the Spirit. Each day he exchanged fear for faith, loneliness for communion, and sorrow for joy, not by effort, but by surrender. This exchange is what gave his words eternal power. He no longer preached about God from the outside. He expressed the life of Christ from within. Every teaching, every prayer, every silence carried the fragrance of one who had learned to cease striving and let God live through him. The exchanged life was Watchman Nee's greatest secret, a quiet revolution within the soul. It taught him that holiness is not achieved but received, that victory is not fought for but entered into. His life became a living testimony of this divine exchange, showing that when man steps aside, God steps in. And in that sacred surrender, human weakness becomes the stage for divine strength to be revealed in all its glory. Watchman Nee lived with an unshakable awareness of the invisible realm, the spiritual reality that governs all things seen and unseen. To him, life on earth was only a shadow of a deeper truth unfolding in the heavens. He understood that every thought, every decision, and every conflict had a spiritual dimension that few could discern. This awareness did not make him mystical or detached from the world. Rather, it made him profoundly alert, humble, and dependent on God. He saw life not merely as a sequence of events, but as a battlefield between light and darkness, spirit and flesh, obedience and rebellion. Because of this, he lived every moment with spiritual sensitivity, always seeking to align himself with the divine will that moved behind the visible. He often taught that believers must learn to see beyond the surface. To Watchman Nee, the physical world is governed by spiritual laws, and ignorance of those laws leads to defeat. He emphasized that spiritual blindness, not lack of opportunity or knowledge, is what cripples most Christians. True vision, he said, comes only through revelation, not reasoning. When God opens a person's eyes, they begin to discern not only what is happening, but why it is happening. They understand motives, spiritual pressures, and divine timing. This kind of discernment cannot be learned in books. It is born in prayer, obedience, and intimacy with God. In his own life, Watchman Nee demonstrated this discernment again and again. Whether leading the church in China or enduring persecution, he saw beyond the outward events. When others saw political chaos, he saw God's hand preparing his people for purification. When others saw betrayal or loss, he recognized divine pruning, meant to strengthen the roots of faith. This perspective gave him peace in seasons of crisis, because he knew that nothing in the visible world could touch him unless it was permitted by the invisible hand of God. His deep awareness of the spiritual realm also kept him vigilant against subtle attacks of pride, fear, or deception. He understood that Satan's primary strategy was not always open sin, but quiet distraction, turning the believer's eyes from the eternal to the temporary. To guard against this, Watchman Nee trained his spirit to remain awake even when life seemed ordinary. He practiced listening inwardly before reacting outwardly. He waited for divine prompting before making decisions, trusting that the Spirit's whisper was more accurate than the loudest voice of circumstance. During his years of imprisonment, this spiritual vision sustained him. He was cut off from the physical church, but not from the spiritual one. He sensed the movement of the body of Christ around the world, and he prayed as if he were still among them. His spirit remained engaged in a higher fellowship that no bars could contain. The awareness of the unseen gave him strength to endure suffering with grace, knowing that behind every moment of silence, heaven was still working. Watchman Nee's life teaches that the truly spiritual man walks by vision, not by sight. He lives from the inside out, guided by eternal truth rather than visible evidence. This invisible awareness made Nee untouchable in spirit, calm in chaos, steady in storms, and radiant even in confinement. For him, the unseen world was more real than the seen, and because of that, he walked in a peace and power that only those with spiritual vision can ever understand. Watchman Nee's hidden life was deeply marked by the power of silence. To him, silence was not emptiness, but fullness, a sacred space where the soul could hear God without distortion. He believed that in silence, the deepest battles of the heart are fought, and the most intimate revelations are received. In an age where noise dominates even spiritual activity, Watchman Nee's practice of holy silence stood as a radical statement of faith. He understood that the voice of God is rarely heard amid the clamor of human striving, and that the soul must be quieted before divine wisdom can descend. For Watchman Nee, silence was not a passive withdrawal from the world, but an active form of surrender. It was the discipline of restraining the self, the impulse to speak, to defend, to explain, to prove, and allowing God to be the sole speaker in the room of the heart. He once wrote that silence before God is the language of trust, for only those who trust Him can remain quiet when everything around them demands reaction. In silence, he let go of the urge to control outcomes, confident that the Lord was already working in ways unseen. This stillness became his refuge, his furnace of purification, and his training ground for spiritual authority. During his ministry, there were moments when Nee chose silence over explanation, even in the face of accusation and misunderstanding. His followers and critics alike were sometimes bewildered by his calm restraint, but his silence was never weakness, it was wisdom. He recognized that defending himself could hinder the greater work God was doing in hiddenness. By remaining silent, he allowed truth to vindicate itself in time. This posture mirrored the example of Christ, who remained silent before his accusers, trusting the Father's justice more than human words. In his times of imprisonment, silence became his companion and teacher. Cut off from the noise of ministry, books, and fellowship, he turned inward to the still voice of God that speaks when all else is stripped away. Those who later read his writings sensed that this prolonged silence did not diminish him, it deepened him. It became the soil in which his spirit took root in eternity. His letters from prison, sparse yet powerful, carried a depth of peace that could only come from one who had mastered the discipline of listening more than speaking. Watchman Nee's silence also symbolized spiritual authority under control. He knew that those who talk much often dilute their spiritual strength, while those who guard their words channel divine power with precision. His restraint gave his speech weight when he did speak. Heaven seemed to echo his words. It is said that his very presence carried quiet conviction, not through rhetoric, but through spiritual stillness. His silence was a testimony that God himself was enough, that truth did not need human defense, and that communion with the divine was richer than any conversation among men. Ultimately, Watchman Nee's silence was the sound of surrender, the silence of a soul that had ceased striving and learned to rest in perfect obedience. In that silence, he heard eternity whisper. In that silence, his inner man grew strong. And in that silence, the secret life of Watchman Nee became a living sermon, that true power is not in speaking much, but in being still enough to hear the voice that created the world. Watchman Nee's secret life was built upon an unshakable trust in God's timing, a quiet conviction that divine purposes unfold perfectly, even when human eyes see only delay or disappointment. He believed that impatience is one of the greatest enemies of spiritual maturity because it reveals a lack of faith in the sovereignty of God. In his writings and his life, he demonstrated that waiting is not wasting, it is worship. To him, every season of delay was an invitation to deepen faith, to let God shape the inner man until he could be trusted with the fulfillment of his promises. Throughout his ministry, Watchman Nee faced countless situations that would have driven most people to despair. He saw his churches scattered by persecution, his co-workers imprisoned, and his own voice silenced for decades. Yet he never allowed these trials to produce bitterness or complaint. Instead, he viewed them as sacred pauses in the rhythm of divine purpose. He often said that God's delays are never his denials, they are his designs. Waiting to Nee was not inactivity, but a spiritual posture of readiness. It was the process through which faith is purified, motives are refined, and the will is aligned with heaven. He understood that rushing ahead of God always leads to spiritual loss. When believers move before divine timing, they step out of grace and into their own strength. Watchman Nee had learned through years of walking with God that true fruit is born only in God's time, never in human haste. He often used the example of seeds. No matter how much one waters or tends them, they will not grow until the appointed season arrives. Similarly, the spiritual life cannot be forced. It must unfold according to divine rhythm. The man or woman who has learned to wait in faith has entered into the deepest rest, for they have ceased striving and begun trusting. In prison, this truth became his lifeline. For 20 long years, he waited not for release, but for the perfect will of God to be accomplished. To others, it seemed as if his ministry had ended, but in reality, it was only maturing in silence. Through patient endurance, he became a living testimony that God's work is never limited by circumstance or time. His letters, though few, carried the fragrance of eternity because they were written from a heart fully surrendered to divine timing. When the world forgot him, heaven remembered him, and his influence continued to grow long after his voice was silenced. This hidden trust in divine timing gave Watchman Nee an inner peace that could not be shaken by external events. He did not measure success by visible outcomes, but by obedience. He believed that when the time is right, God himself will open doors no man can shut. Until then, the soul must rest, pray, and remain faithful in the small, unseen tasks of the present. For him, waiting was a form of worship, a declaration that God's plan is always better than man's impatience. In the end, Watchman Nee's life revealed that the one who learns to wait upon God does not lose time, they redeem it. Each moment of waiting becomes a moment of becoming, each delay a deeper surrender to eternal purposes. His secret trust in divine timing was not passive resignation but living faith, anchored in the belief that everything unfolds perfectly when the soul is still and God alone moves. Watchman Nee's final and most profound secret was the mystery of transformation through suffering. He understood that suffering, when surrendered to God, becomes the furnace where the soul is refined and the spirit becomes radiant. While most people view pain as a curse or misfortune, Watchman Nee saw it as a divine instrument, a tool in the hands of a loving Father to shape his children into the likeness of Christ. To him, suffering was never meaningless. It was the language through which God speaks most clearly to those he loves deeply. Every trial, every loss, every betrayal was an opportunity to die a little more to self, so that the life of Christ could shine more purely through him. Throughout his ministry, Watchman Nee endured physical weakness, imprisonment, isolation, and misunderstanding, yet he never allowed bitterness to take root. He embraced suffering as a sacred calling, not as punishment, but as participation in the sufferings of Christ. His understanding was that only through brokenness can the life of God flow freely, just as oil cannot be released from the olive until it is crushed, so the life of the Spirit cannot emerge from the believer until the outer man has been broken. This truth became the heartbeat of his teaching. Brokenness is not destruction, it is liberation. The breaking of the self-life allows the inner life of Christ to manifest unhindered. During his years in prison, Watchman Nee's suffering deepened into a holy intimacy with God. Stripped of freedom, ministry, and companionship, he came face to face with the sufficiency of Christ alone. His pain became a sanctuary, a place where divine comfort replaced human consolation. He learned to find joy in suffering, not because it was pleasant, but because it drew him closer to the heart of God. It was there, in silence and confinement, that he discovered the purest form of faith, one that no longer depends on blessing, results, or recognition. His suffering taught him to love God not for what he gives, but for who he is. This transformation through suffering also gave his words enduring authority. When he spoke of surrender, it was not theory, it was testimony. Every line of his teaching carried the weight of experience, purified by pain and validated by endurance. Those who read his writings can sense that his faith was not borrowed but born from the fire. He wrote not as a scholar, but as one who had walked through the valley of death and emerged alive in spirit. His brokenness became a channel of divine strength for others, a living sermon that God's grace is made perfect in weakness. Ultimately, Watchman Nee's secret was that suffering, when accepted in faith, is not the end of life, but the beginning of resurrection. He discovered that every cross conceals a crown, every breaking hides a blessing, and every pain carries the seed of eternal glory. The world saw a man imprisoned and forgotten, but heaven saw a vessel being perfected. His suffering became his sanctification, and his sanctification became his message. By embracing the cross, Watchman Nee revealed the hidden path to true power, the power that comes only when the self is broken, and the life of Christ alone remains. There are some truths in the life of Watchman Nee that were never spoken, never written, and never taught, truths that lived and breathed in silence. His entire walk with God was built upon a depth few could ever perceive, a sacred quietness that contained more power than 1,000 words. While the world remembers his sermons, his books, and his influence, few understand that behind every revelation he shared was a deeper revelation he chose to hide. The power that poured from his life did not come from eloquence or study, but from a divine encounter found in stillness, a place where the soul meets God without noise, without applause, without need to explain. Watchman Nee was a man who carried mysteries, not because he wanted to be secretive, but because some divine experiences are too holy for human language. He understood that silence is not the absence of speech, it is the presence of depth. In silence, he found correction, direction, and communion. His silence was not passive, it was alive with worship, heavy with prayer, and filled with divine awareness. When he withdrew from the noise of men, he entered the sound of heaven. What he buried in silence was not a loss, but a preservation of the sacred. This message is not just about Watchman Nee's discipline, it is about the hidden life that every true believer must learn to live. In a world obsessed with expression, Watchman Nee discovered transformation through restraint. He became a man who spoke only after heaven had spoken first. His silence was not weakness but strength, not ignorance but revelation. It was through silence that his inner life was refined, his will was broken, and his spirit became one with the will of God. To understand the secret he buried in silence is to understand the spiritual principle that true power is hidden, not displayed. It is not what is said that changes lives, but what is carried within. Watchman Nee's silence was the womb of his ministry. It birthed his insight, his conviction, and his authority. The man who appeared quiet before people was roaring in faith before God. In the stillness of his soul, divine truths were whispered, and through that sacred stillness, a generation was transformed. The question is not what he said, but what he heard in silence, and that is the secret he carried to his grave. Watchman Nee's silence was not a void or an escape from the world. It was the most sacred part of his relationship with God. To many, silence is uncomfortable, even unbearable, but to Watchman Nee, it was the only place where the noise of the world faded enough for heaven to be heard. He believed that silence was not emptiness but fullness, not absence but presence. In silence, the voice of God became clearer, stronger, and more personal. It was within this sacred stillness that his soul was trained to listen rather than to speak, to receive rather than to express. Every great revelation that came from his life began in those moments when he shut out every human sound and waited quietly for the Spirit to move. He treated silence as a holy sanctuary where God alone was welcome. When others sought platforms and public voices, he sought a hidden room. In that room there was no audience, no applause, and no recognition. Only a heart laid bare before its Creator. He understood that the truest form of worship is not in words but in surrender. Silence became his altar, and on it he laid down his thoughts, his ambitions, and his fleshly strength. He would often remain in stillness for long hours, not trying to force prayer, not chasing visions, but simply allowing the Spirit to speak when he willed. This discipline transformed him from a man of ideas into a man of divine revelation. In silence, his soul was purified. The constant chatter of the mind, the desires of the flesh, and the distractions of the world had to die there. He knew that the Spirit cannot be heard in a crowded heart, so he made space through silence for God to dwell richly. That is where his faith grew roots. When persecution came, it was not eloquence that sustained him, but the stillness he had cultivated in private. Silence taught him to be steady when the world trembled, to trust when answers were withheld, and to worship even when his freedom was taken. His silence also reflected his humility. Watchman Nee knew that the man who speaks too quickly often speaks from self, not from spirit. He feared saying anything that heaven had not approved, so he practiced the art of waiting, of letting silence season his heart before words were released. This made his speech rare, yet full of weight. When he finally spoke, people listened, because his words carried the fragrance of one who had been with God. His silence gave birth to spiritual authority. It separated him from the noise of religion and connected him to the heartbeat of eternity. Through silence, Watchman Nee found what many miss, that intimacy with God is not built on expression, but on communion. He buried himself in the quiet until his soul became one with divine rhythm. He did not seek to impress men, but to please the one who sees in secret. In that silence, his spirit was refined, his flesh was crucified, and his life became a living testimony of heaven's voice, spoken through a man who had learned how to be still. Watchman Nee believed that not every divine revelation was meant to be spoken, and this conviction shaped the quiet power of his ministry. He understood that God sometimes entrusts truths so holy, so personal, that they lose their weight when expressed in words. For him, revelation was not something to be displayed, but something to be protected. What God whispered in the hidden chambers of his heart was sacred, and he treated it as such. He carried spiritual truths like a vessel carries precious oil carefully, reverently, knowing that one careless word could spill what heaven had poured. He recognized that some experiences with God are meant to be lived, not shared, because their value is found not in communication, but in transformation. In his writings, he often hinted that there are depths of the Spirit that cannot be taught through speech, but only through personal encounter. That is why his silence became an act of obedience, rather than secrecy. He knew that when a man speaks of holy things too freely, they can become common in the ears of others. For Watchman Nee, it was better to guard the mystery than to risk it being misunderstood. He would rather live the truth deeply than teach it shallowly. His restraint was not a sign of fear, but of reverence. He did not want to draw attention to himself or turn divine experiences into doctrine. He wanted to preserve the purity of what God had shown him. This understanding of spiritual confidentiality also revealed his profound humility. Watchman Nee saw himself as a steward, not an owner, of revelation. He believed that divine secrets were given for transformation, not for display. If God revealed something to him in silence, it was meant to change his heart before it ever reached another's ears. He never wanted to speak prematurely, knowing that truth spoken without maturity can harm rather than help. His silence, therefore, became a form of spiritual discipline, a guard against pride and a shield for the sacred. He lived in a world that often demanded expression, yet he chose restraint. When others wanted to hear new teachings or spiritual experiences, he offered only what he knew God permitted him to share. The rest he buried in his heart, like Mary did with the angel's words. That buried truth, hidden from public eyes, became the well from which his spiritual strength flowed. The less he revealed, the deeper he went. He learned that silence could protect revelation from corruption. allowing it to grow pure and strong within. In a time when many sought to speak before they had listened, Watchman Nee practiced the opposite, listening before he spoke, and sometimes choosing never to speak at all. He understood that the true measure of a spiritual man is not how much he can say, but how much of God he carries within. His silence was not a void, it was a treasury filled with divine secrets known only to those who walk closely with God. The revelations he kept unspoken did not die with him. They lived on in the power of his life, his humility, and the quiet authority that flowed from a heart that valued heaven's secrets more than human applause. Silence, to Watchman Nee, was not a passive state, but an active encounter. He believed that silence was a living classroom where the soul was taught by the Spirit in ways no man could explain. When he withdrew from noise and human conversation, it was not to isolate himself, but to listen more clearly to heaven. In that sacred quietness, the Holy Spirit became his teacher, unveiling truths layer by layer in a language only the inner man could understand. It was there, in the depths of silence, that he learned how to discern God's presence, how to recognize his voice among the thousand competing sounds of life, and how to walk in obedience without hesitation. He realized early in his spiritual journey that words can sometimes become barriers instead of bridges. Too much speaking, even in prayer, can drown out the very voice one is trying to hear. Silence, therefore, became his act of faith that God was near, faith that God would speak when it was time, and faith that understanding could come without noise. In the stillness of his heart, revelation became clearer. The Spirit of God had room to move freely because the clutter of thought and emotion had been set aside. He would often remain still for long stretches, not asking questions, not demanding answers, but simply waiting. That waiting was his worship. The longer he waited, the softer his soul became, and in that softness he began to perceive divine whispers that could never be captured by human words. This discipline of silence trained his spirit in discernment. He learned to recognize when a thought was from God and when it was from the flesh. In the rush of daily life, that line can blur, but in silence the difference became distinct. The quiet taught him that divine truth does not compete for attention. It waits to be received by those who are still enough to listen. Through that stillness, he grew sensitive to spiritual realities unseen by others. His spiritual perception became sharper, and his decisions more aligned with the will of God. Watchman Nee often spoke about the importance of inner hearing, the ability to listen to the Spirit without distraction. But what he did not often reveal was that this ability came through years of disciplined silence. Silence purified his motives, stilled his ambitions, and allowed the Holy Spirit to govern his soul. It was not an easy discipline. It required death to self, patience, and faith in the unseen. Yet from that quiet soil, his wisdom and authority grew. In a world where men spoke quickly and often, Watchman Nee's silence became his greatest distinction. People were drawn not just to what he said, but to what they felt when he said it. His words carried power because they were born in stillness. His silence gave his speech authority. It taught him what no man could teach, that the most powerful voice a believer can ever hear is the one that speaks in the quiet places of the heart. And in that holy quietness, Watchman Nee learned the language of heaven. Watchman Nee practiced what he called hidden obedience, doing what God asked of him in silence, without ever needing to explain, justify, or announce it to others. To him, obedience was not a performance. It was an offering. He understood that when the heart is fully surrendered, actions speak louder than sermons, and obedience becomes the purest form of worship. Hidden obedience was his way of keeping his walk with God sacred, unpolluted by pride or public recognition. He did not obey to be seen or praised. He obeyed because he had already died to himself. Every unseen act of faith was his way of saying, "Lord, you alone are my audience." There were moments when God required him to do things that made no sense to human understanding. Instead of arguing or seeking approval, he simply obeyed. He trusted that if God had spoken, that was enough. This quiet compliance shaped the depth of his spiritual authority. He once wrote that obedience without understanding is the truest form of faith, because it reveals where trust really lies. To obey publicly is easy. It comes with affirmation, but to obey secretly, when no one is watching, is the truest test of character. Watchman Nee lived in that secret realm. He gave when no one saw, he forgave when no one understood, and he prayed when no one asked. Every hidden act became a brick in the unseen foundation of his ministry. His hidden obedience also protected him from spiritual pride. He knew how easily the human heart can corrupt even the holiest actions when others are watching. So he hid his obedience the way a man hides treasure. When he fasted, he did not speak of it. When he prayed through the night, he never mentioned it. He allowed God alone to see those moments, trusting that the approval of heaven was worth infinitely more than the applause of men. This secret life gave his public ministry a power that others could not imitate. People saw the fruit, but never the root, the anointing, but not the altar it was born from. Even in times of persecution, his obedience did not fade. When imprisoned, he continued to follow the inner promptings of the Spirit, even when obedience meant greater suffering. He did not question God's fairness or timing. He simply yielded. His submission in silence became a sermon more powerful than his words. He showed that real obedience does not need an audience. It only needs a surrendered heart. Through hidden obedience, Watchman Nee demonstrated that the strength of a believer is not measured by how loudly they proclaim their faith, but by how faithfully they follow God in the dark. His obedience was the secret rhythm of his spiritual heartbeat, unseen by men but deeply known in heaven. And it was through that quiet faithfulness that God used him to impact generations. In a world that celebrates visibility, Watchman Nee found glory in invisibility. His greatest victories were won in silence, and his truest obedience was buried deep, where only God could see. Watchman Nee's final and perhaps most profound secret was the strength he found in brokenness. To the world, brokenness looks like failure, but to him, it was the doorway through which divine life could flow. He believed that God could never truly use a man until that man had been broken before him. Every trial, every humiliation, and every suffering he endured became a tool in God's hand, shaping him into a vessel that could carry heaven's fragrance. Brokenness was not something he avoided. It was something he embraced, for he understood that in the shattering of self, the Spirit finds freedom to move. Throughout his life, Watchman Nee faced betrayal, rejection, imprisonment, and illness. Yet he never allowed bitterness to grow. Instead, he saw each hardship as a divine invitation to die to his own will and depend more deeply on Christ's strength. He wrote that only those who are broken can feed others, meaning that only when pride, ambition, and self-reliance are crushed can the life of Jesus shine through. His pain was not wasted, it was transformed into spiritual authority. The more he was broken, the more others were blessed through him. Brokenness stripped away his need for control. It taught him to rest in God's timing, even when everything seemed uncertain. In his darkest seasons, he found that surrender was the only path to peace. His imprisonment became a school of the Spirit, a place where all his teachings were tested in fire. There, stripped of freedom and reputation, he met God in a way few ever do. His silence became deeper, his faith quieter but stronger, his dependence total. He once said that brokenness is not something we achieve, but something we accept when God allows it. It is His way of making the vessel transparent so that His glory, not ours, can shine through. Every great message that Watchman Nee ever preached was born from that broken place. He didn't just speak about dying to self, he lived it. When people listened to him, they felt something beyond human wisdom. They felt the authority of one who had suffered, surrendered, and been remade by grace. His brokenness became the channel through which others found healing. The words that flowed from his lips were soaked in tears that had already been cried in the presence of God. Even at the end of his life, as he lay confined and forgotten by the world, he wrote with peace and joy. His final note, discovered after his death, simply declared his faith and love for Christ. That final act of quiet surrender was the culmination of a life spent being broken and remade by the Master's hand. For Watchman Nee, brokenness was not defeat, it was transformation. The shattering of the self made room for the indwelling Christ to live unhindered. What the world saw as tragedy, heaven recognized as triumph. Through every loss, he gained something eternal. And in that silent, sacred breaking, the man disappeared, but Christ within him became visible to the world. Watchman Nee's hidden life was sustained by what he called the discipline of secrecy in prayer. To him, prayer was not a tool for public devotion or spiritual recognition, but the lifeline of his soul, the sacred meeting place between man and God. He never prayed to impress others or to display his spirituality. Instead, he prayed to disappear, to lose himself entirely in the presence of God. Prayer for Nee was a private sanctuary, a quiet retreat where no audience existed except the one who listened in secret. This was why his spiritual power ran so deep. It was rooted not in public moments, but in the invisible hours of communion that no one ever saw. He often taught that the measure of a believer's spiritual maturity is not seen in how they pray before others, but in how they pray when no one is watching. In that hidden space, Watchman Nee poured out his heart with honesty. His prayers were not elaborate speeches. They were whispers of surrender, confessions of weakness, and cries of longing for more of God. He believed that real prayer was not about changing circumstances, but about transforming the heart to align with the will of God. The more he prayed, the more he lost interest in earthly gain, fame, or comfort. His prayers became a form of self-emptying, a continual laying down of his desires before the throne of grace. Over the years, his secret prayers became his strength in suffering. When the world silenced his voice, prayer kept his spirit alive. When the prison walls closed around him, prayer opened the heavens above him. In that confinement, he learned that true freedom is not the absence of chains, but the presence of God. Each whispered prayer, offered in darkness and loneliness, became a flame of light in his soul. He prayed not for escape, but for endurance, not for comfort, but for communion. Through this, his faith was purified, and his dependence on Christ deepened beyond measure. Watchman Nee also understood the danger of prayer becoming mechanical or self God-centered. That's why he practiced the discipline of silence before prayer, listening before speaking, waiting before asking. In those moments, he allowed the Holy Spirit to guide his thoughts and reshape his desires. Many times he would begin prayer in anguish and end it in peace, because the act of listening changed him more than the act of speaking. He realized that prayer was not meant to move God's hand as much as it was meant to mold the heart of man. What made his secret prayer life so powerful was its consistency. He prayed even when he felt nothing, even when answers didn't come, and even when he was weary. That faithfulness built an invisible history between him and God, a history that became the foundation of all his public ministry. While others sought to be seen, he sought to be hidden in the secret place, for there he found the presence that gave meaning to everything else. Watchman Nee's unseen prayers became the fragrance of his life, the invisible incense rising from a heart that had found its home in God. And because he lived in that secret place, everything he spoke, wrote, and endured carried the quiet authority of a man who had truly been with the Almighty. Watchman Nee's life carried a quiet mystery, the power of divine waiting. He often spoke about the discipline of learning to wait on God without anxiety, doubt, or impatience. For him, waiting was not inaction. It was a deep spiritual posture of trust. He believed that every true work of God begins in waiting, not striving. The flesh wants results, recognition, and movement, but the Spirit calls for stillness, timing, and surrender. In this hidden waiting, Watchman Nee found strength that human effort could never produce. He came to see that God's delays are not denials, but divine preparations, shaping both the man and the moment before his purpose is revealed. Throughout his ministry, there were countless times when he could have advanced by his own power, speaking more, organizing more, or promoting himself. Yet, he consistently chose to wait for God's confirmation rather than move by human impulse. He taught that spiritual fruit cannot be forced. It must grow in the soil of patience. In his writings, he often compared waiting on God to a seed lying buried in the ground. The seed must remain hidden for a time, unseen, until the right season of growth comes. Likewise, he understood that his ministry, his influence, even his freedom, all rested on divine timing. This perspective gave him peace in seasons when everything around him seemed silent or stagnant. His time in prison became the ultimate test of this discipline. For 20 years, he waited in confinement while the world moved on without him. Many might have seen it as wasted potential, but for Nee, it was holy preparation. In the quiet of his cell, he waited on God, not with frustration, but with faith. Each day, he laid his future at God's feet, believing that if his silence was God's will, then his waiting was his ministry. That kind of surrender could only come from a man who had died to self and lived entirely for the purposes of heaven. Waiting also refined his discernment. He learned that rushing ahead of God often leads to spiritual emptiness. In waiting, he developed the sensitivity to recognize the subtle movements of the Spirit, the divine yes, no, or not yet. This sensitivity became one of his greatest spiritual strengths. It kept his ministry pure, his words weighty, and his steps sure. When he finally spoke or acted, it was not from impulse, but from revelation. Many people admired Watchman Nee's insight, but did not realize that his wisdom was born in waiting. He had learned to sit quietly under the hand of God until understanding came. Waiting taught him humility, patience, and dependence. It stripped him of ambition and clothed him with grace. The longer he waited, the clearer God's voice became. In a world obsessed with speed and results, Watchman Nee's quiet endurance stands as a timeless lesson. He showed that those who truly know God are never in a hurry. His waiting was worship, his stillness strength, and his patience power. And in that divine waiting, his life became a living testimony that God's perfect timing always carries eternal purpose. Watchman Nee understood the mystery of spiritual isolation, a sacred solitude that God often uses to refine his chosen vessels. To the ordinary eye, isolation looks like abandonment, but to the spiritual man, it is an invitation into deeper intimacy with the divine. Watchman Nee did not fear being alone, for he knew that God's most profound work is often done in hidden places where no one is watching. His seasons of isolation were not signs of God's absence. They were proof of his presence. In silence, in confinement, and in the quiet corners of life, he encountered revelations that could not have been learned in crowds or noise. He believed that God often separates those he intends to use greatly. Before the voice can be trusted to speak to others, it must first be purified in silence. Nee's years of ministry were marked by these divine withdrawals, times when God pulled him away from public work into the wilderness of stillness. In those moments, he was stripped of human dependence and comfort. Friends drifted away, opportunities closed, and the noise of ministry faded into stillness. But in that very solitude, his roots went deeper into God. He once said that the man who has never been alone with God has never truly known God. Isolation became the furnace in which his faith was purified and his heart was emptied of self. During his imprisonment, this lesson reached its fullness. The walls around him became the boundaries of his new sanctuary. He had no pulpit, no congregation, no freedom. Only his Bible and his God. Yet in that stillness, something miraculous happened. His inner man grew stronger than ever before. The Word became alive in him. The Spirit became his only companion, and Christ became his only joy. What others saw as tragedy, he saw as training. The solitude that could have destroyed him, instead, transformed him into a vessel of unshakable faith. Watchman Nee discovered that isolation is not meant to break the believer, but to deepen them. When God hides a man, it is because he is preparing him for something that cannot yet be seen. Nee learned to stop resisting isolation and began to embrace it as part of the divine process. In the absence of noise, his discernment sharpened. In the absence of applause, his humility deepened, and in the absence of fellowship, his communion with God became all the more real. He came to realize that the presence of God in solitude is sweeter than the company of men. True fellowship is not always found in crowds, but in communion with the Spirit. He learned to talk less with people and more with heaven, and when he finally did speak, his words carried the weight of a man who had walked alone with God and returned with the fragrance of eternity. The spiritual isolation of Watchman Nee was not a curse, but a calling. It was in that divine loneliness that his soul was refined, his pride crushed, and his vision clarified. From his solitude came revelation, from his silence came strength. And though the world may have forgotten him for a time, heaven never did, for isolation had only hidden him in the shadow of God's hand, waiting for the perfect moment when the hidden vessel would shine with the light of eternity